Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Please take your seats. The session will begin momentarily. Ladies and gentlemen, from DataBlick, please welcome to the stage Noah Salvaterra.
Hello, welcome. Oh, this is a very powerful feeling to be up here speaking amplified. We're at the Tableau conference. In case anyone didn't know, Tableau likes to put this up front, so we remember. But today I'm going to talk about a situation that I've seen happen in a lot of companies. We got Tableau, but the CEO loves tables. There's two talks that could have that title. I'm going to give the second one. The first is the one you might expect, that is how to convince the CEO to love tables. I'd love to give that talk. That'd be a beautiful talk. But this is a situation I found myself in where I was working with someone a couple levels down from the CEO, and we just had to make the table. We didn't have an opportunity for pushback. So we're going to do it. We're going to make the table. And it's probably the worst table I've ever seen. That's me, I think. I don't know. So somebody told me it looks like Slender Man. You see some math around there. I do math sometimes, but I work at DataBlick. Let's see. I am a Tableau consultant, I mentioned. I also do some Alteryx, and I have a son whose name is Lemuel Mako Salvaterra. See that middle name there is bold because he gets that from Joe Mako. If anybody doesn't know Joe, he's one of the most brilliant and kindest people I've ever known in my life. So get to know Joe if you happen to run into him. He's a great guy. My son's actually a little older than that. Now he looks a little more like that. I had to actually bribe him to get that angry in the picture. I wanted a good, angry face. So I promised him, a jewelry making kit. That's more his personality. And a compliment I've gotten before is that I make Tableau look like it isn't Tableau. Sometimes that means I make it look like D3 or some other tools. You can see too far. I did a chord diagram in Tableau, for example. This is entirely in Tableau. It's interactive, and we can do these things now with things with the extension library, or maybe at some point we will. I don't know if there's a chord diagram in there yet, but surely there will be someday. I put a Tesla in Tableau, just for fun. It's actually 3D if you have the glasses. Should have got an audience set of glasses, but I didn't. Or a spinning globe with data on it. Tableau doesn't do 3D, right? So I like to break the rules in Tableau, and I like to make visualizations that are difficult to make. But we're not going to do a spinning globe with data on it today. Today we're going to look at this. Okay? It's awful, right? This is a real thing that I was asked to produce in Tableau. And of course, to talk about this, I need to give some disclaimers, because this is like dark side stuff that we're going to talk about. But First of all, I wouldn't want you to think I have anything against my clients because I was asked to do this. It was a situation we found ourselves in, but my clients are brilliant. They're great at what they do, and they may not be as focused on data visualization as I am. And also, I have nothing against CEOs. Most of them are brilliant folks too, or they wouldn't be in the position that they're in. I have encountered a few who like tables, but they can actually look at tables and get something out of it, which is a skill that I just don't have. And that's part of the reason I do what I do. So it's more about that separation that exists from the CEO. So giant table of numbers, don't do it if you have a choice. It should be the last option. You should definitely push back whenever you're asked to do something like this. And also, this is not what Datablick does. We're not big table consulting. And I realized last night I didn't have any beautiful dashboards in my presentation, so I just put a couple. This is my partner, Anya Ahern, who is brilliant and accomplished in many ways. It's a great dashboard of hers that was in her presentation. I thought it was beautiful and insightful and clean, engaging. That's what you want, right? Here's a very, very simple dashboard of mine that was for a mobile device, so that's why it's sort of a weird size. But so why would we do this in Tableau? I've started to mention that already a little bit. This was an actual request. The data is Superstore. I'm not showing you any client data, but the structure is exactly what they asked for in every way. And we had to do it. My option here was either tell the client I couldn't do it, push back to a point where I wouldn't have the job anymore, or make it happen. And when I first looked at this challenge, I wasn't sure I could do it at all. So I had to think about it a little bit to figure this one out. And the third reason, sometimes Tableau is purchased to replace something. You have a reporting tool and certain reports that exist in that tool, but now you get Tableau, and that's great, and you can make beautiful, engaging visualizations, but some people are still attached to the old reports. Do you have to continue to pay for 2 different reporting tools, or can you migrate these reports to Tableau while you convince these people that they should look at things in a better way? So this is sort of a way to maybe get those people, make them happy while you start producing better reports, and eventually they'll see what's going on and get it. But it avoids that shock. Okay. And finally, why would I talk about this at TCC? Or it's just TC now. It used to be Tableau Customer Conference. Now it's just TC, Tableau Conference. Sorry about that. But I showed this once at a local meetup. I just tacked it on to the end of a talk because it was something that I had done. And people went nuts. They couldn't believe it. They were asking all about it. I had to put it on my Tableau Public after. And they really wanted to see more of that. So clearly people had struggled with making things like this in Tableau before. There's a bunch of interesting techniques that even if you manage to avoid making horrible tables like this, you might use them in nicer ways. And maybe I'll have a chance to mention some of those. And finally, I've seen companies lose Tableau because it can't replace that legacy tool. It makes it seem weak that, you know, it's a replacement for SSRS, but it can't make the reports that SSRS made because it really wants to force you to make good ones, which is great if you're starting from scratch, but we don't always have that flexibility. Okay, so we need to replicate this in Tableau. And that word replicate was meant very literally in this case. This comes from BOSS, right? And so I look at this table and my mind starts to spin. There's a few challenges I see. There's some gaps in the table. They're not at regular intervals. Some gaps on columns, some gaps on rows. There's one weird header there that's indented. Net income there is indented for some reason. I didn't get into why. It's just the way it was, and they wanted it indented. That CM%, the whole line, is italicized. The whole line, even the header. Half of those headers are bold, half of them aren't. The column headers are centered. It's a mess. There's 5 different number formats in this table, right? Some shading in the background, some shading in the rows and in the columns, and not at regular intervals in the way that Tableau likes to do. So this is a bit of a challenge. Also, they wanted it to be fast, and they wanted it to be adaptive, right? So I started to think about this. And I pushed back on everything on this slide. Like, do you really need the column bands? Do you really need gaps in the table in exactly this way? They needed it all. They did not want the CEO to even notice that we had switched the report to Tableau. Okay, so that's the challenge. So I took a deep breath. And I took a nap. And when I woke up from my nap, you know, I had some things in my head. But the first reason this is challenging that came to mind is how Tableau handles data, how Tableau likes to present data in a worksheet. And I know Tableau is not sentient, so it doesn't like anything really, but that's the kind of the relationship I have with Tableau, is sometimes it's working with me and sometimes it's not. But in this case, Tableau doesn't like to reuse a row from your data set. Doesn't like to use row 13 here and here. Kind of wants to use it just here or just here. And there's a couple ways, well, 3 ways at least that I could think of that might be exceptions to this rule. The most obvious is to use a combination of measure names, measure values. You can get multiple measures on your sheet at once in that way. The second is a little more technical, is blending rows, blending your data source. So data that comes in from a blended data source, if it happens to be at a different granularity from the view, then you may be able to recycle rows in that way and show numbers wherever you want. The third way that I thought I should add it there, it's sort of possible at least, that you could use LOD calculations or table calculations maybe to get, you know, a number here, a number here. I think it would be tricky to do it that way. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm not going to get into LOD or table calculations. And the folks that, if anyone saw the spinning globe and worried that I was going to use my, you know, my math background and throw a bunch of trigonometry at you, all I'm using is addition. This talk consists of addition. That's as hard as the math gets. So if you've got addition, we're good. Okay. So I'm going to start with a sort of simple example, sort of toy case of this table, and work our way up to the whole thing. I just want to look at this top corner, sales and variable costs, yesterday from this year and yesterday from last year, and the percent change. And look at how I might try to visualize this in Tableau. So the first, I mentioned you can use measure names, measure values. I can put measure names on rows, measure values on text, and I get a table. I get 2 different measures. So I'm recycling data, and I'm using yesterday's data both for sales and variable cost. Great, okay? I want to introduce a sort of a simple concept that I use to deal with calculations like the ones in this example. I call this a filtered calculation. This is a very simple example of it, that if order date is today minus 1, so if order date is yesterday, then give me the sales. There's no else statement here. So this calculation only sees the sales from yesterday. and a bunch of nulls. So I don't need a filter on my worksheet to use this calculation. If I pull it out, it gives me yesterday's sales. And I haven't filtered the data, so I could get yesterday's sales from this year, and I could do another one and get yesterday's sales from last year, for example, which is the sort of thing I'm going to need to do here. I tend to do this in 2 steps. So instead of doing it all in one calculation, I'll compute a yesterday this year indicator. So that indicator is, I don't know if this, oh, there we go. So if this, I'm not going to use that. I don't think that works very well. But so if order date is yesterday, then give me a 1, otherwise give me nothing. So I just get a 1 for yesterday date rows. And then I multiply that by sales. So yesterday this year times sales would give me sales if the order date happens to be yesterday. Otherwise, it's null. So it's the same effect as that previous slide. And the reason I do that is I make a lot of mistakes. And I'm going to have to build a bunch of calculations. And if I realize I got the formula wrong for month to date last year, and I have it in every one of these calculations, then I have to fix it in every one of those calculations. This way, it's only in one place. I can fix it in one place. It's recycled. Okay. So using these filtered calculations, I can build now another way of using measure names, and that's to use measure names on columns. I get sales from yesterday of this year, sales from yesterday of last year, and then I can just compute a % change and throw that on measure values as well. Okay. So, great. So I have measure names on rows or measure names on columns. But I can't do both. I need more measure names, I need more measure values. I used to want Tableau to have like measure names 1, measure names 2, so I could do stuff like this, but oh, wouldn't that be a mess the more I thought about it? So that's not how I deal with it. Oops. So I should mention a lot of folks I see will get to that example on the right and say, okay, I can make a little bit of this table. And I can just do that a bunch of times and put it together on a dashboard. Have you ever seen that? A bunch of rows to make a table on a dashboard. I've seen that a lot. A lot of times it's because someone will come to me and say, we have this table we built and it's really slow. What's wrong? And the problem here is each one of those worksheets is going to issue a query to the database. In this case, the first way that occurred to me to make this table had 48 worksheets, which is a lot. And if each one of those, probably sequentially, is going to issue a query, it's going to take a long time to get that data back. Maintenance can be challenging with this. I've seen tables like this where 2 rows happen to be switched. And you've got all your headers turned off to just sort of put things together. So it's hard to find that. And it was a struggle to figure out why the numbers were wrong, because swapped tables or swapped worksheets wasn't the first thing that came to mind. And third, this is just a personal preference, maybe because I studied math, but it's not very elegant. If something's ugly, I feel like there's probably a better way. Right? So I just don't like it. Okay, so let's not use measure names, measure values at all. We have other options. And this is how I work when I'm dealing with a problem in Tableau. I have maybe a first approach. It's not going to work. What else do we have in the bag? And so I moved on to rows coming from a blended data source. And I remembered my dear friend Joe Mako did a Think Data Thursday talk years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, on scaffolding, scaffold data sources, and it just blew my mind. And we're going to see some of that here. Okay, so this may seem like a silly question. Which comes first? Your data source, structure or your visualization. And it seems silly because almost all the time, we have a data source and we build a visualization. Have a data source, build a visualization. But sometimes if there's something specific you want, if you have some fancy visualization like a horrible table, you may find it's got a data source structure that's not suited to build that table or that chord diagram or spinning planet with data on it. So another way to approach that is to start from the visualization you have in mind and go backwards and say, what's the data source structure I need? And sometimes I'll find myself lucky enough to be able to work with a tool like Alteryx or something. Anya, get a picture of that so I get a free t-shirt. We used to get t-shirts from Alteryx. I don't know if they still do, but I do like Alteryx. So you don't always have that flexibility in your organization. That's why a lot of people don't even recognize this possibility of sort of moving backwards and saying, what's my dream scenario for my data structure and doing that. Okay, so, but there's a third option, and that's even if you don't have the ability to restructure your underlying data, just make some up. Just make up a convenient data source that would support the visualization. Build the visualization with that, and then hang your data on it, like an ornament, via a data blend. That's how I kind of think of data blends, at least a lot of the time. It's just, you have something, and then you just put something on it. So my simple scaffold that I'm going to use in this case just has 6 rows of data. Has a column called row, very confusing, and a column called column. Those names will make a little more sense in a second. But in row, I have sales variable cost, sales variable cost, sales variable cost. Seems a little repetitive. In column B, I have yesterday this year twice, yesterday last year twice, and yesterday year over year change. This is a Cartesian product of 2 things. And if I put this data source into Tableau and put row and column in the obvious place, then I see something that looks a lot like the table that I want already. It's like I'm almost there. And it's just this made-up data source. So the only problem is it doesn't have any numbers in it. How can I get numbers on that? And the answer, in my case, I go back to Excel, and I create a calculation that I can paste into Tableau. So I have in the function line, you can see how I built this with some concatenation. And I named my row and my column and my calculations in such a way that I could just fill down and build this calculation. So I paste that into Tableau. Of course, I get an error. I should have prepared better. Sorry. Cannot mix aggregate and non-aggregate comparisons or results in cases. Did you ever get the cannot compare aggregate and non-aggregate? Is it just me? Yeah. So the reason you typically get this error is you're trying to do something that makes sense to you, but doesn't make sense to Tableau because it doesn't know what you're doing. It doesn't know what's already in play. And in our case, we have row and we have column on the sheet already. They're in the level of detail. So we could aggregate. In fact, the solution here I put a max around the row column concatenation thing. Just put a max on it, and now it says it's valid. And that max doesn't do anything because row and column are already in the level of detail of the view. So I'm taking the max of a single value. It's just tricking Tableau. Right, so it doesn't have awareness of the level of detail in the view when it's telling you there's something wrong. So, and then, okay, so calculation was valid. I click OK, and then it throws another error at me. This is kind of rough. But fields cannot be used from Sample Superstore. There's no relationship to the primary data source. That's okay. I click OK. In fact, I click OK on this a lot because I don't turn off my errors in Tableau. And that's because I help other people with Tableau sometimes, and I want to see what they see. And if I turn off the errors, I'm not going to know why they're being confused by something. So I just click OK on this all the time. But you can probably click Do Not Show Again and never see it again if you don't want to. We're blending on nothing. That's OK. We want to blend on nothing. We've already filtered our calculations in such a way that bringing in sum of sales from yesterday this year is going to be sum of sales from yesterday this year using the whole data set. Right? So there's nothing. There's no blending fields here. So putting that value calculation, that's a calculation coming from the secondary data source, just putting that on labels, I get my whole table, almost. So the only thing it's missing at this point is number formats. Everything's in the same format. To fix that, I take this row column calculation I built and I break it into two parts. One for things I want formatted as dollars and one for things that I want formatted as percents. And my standard way of naming these things is just to put a suffix on it to remind myself this is the dollars and this is the percent. And sometimes we'll see later you may get more and more formats to deal with. Right? So the first 4 rows only are dollars, and the last 2 rows are percents. So I just comment everything else out and comment in Tableau Calculations as // Is that / or / I think it's a /. Okay. Once you have those 2 calculations, those filtered calculations for your labels with different formats, you put them both on the label shelf. You put them both, on the text shelf. And you format that label, edit label, so that there's no spaces, no carriage returns, nothing in between them. They're just concatenated right up next to each other. Only one of those things ever shows something. Either I have a value that's in dollars, or I have a value that's in percent. And when I have a value that's in dollars, I have a null for the other one, so it's going to show nothing. Only one showing at a time. And you can use this for conditional formatting, too. If you want some circumstances, things to be green, sometimes it to be red, then you can have 2 mutually exclusive calculations, put them both on the label shelf, make one green and make one red. Only one will show up at a time. Okay. So using our scaffold data source as a primary data source gives us the basic structure of this table. We can't get the gaps yet, but we'll see there's another approach that'll get us there. Labels, overloading labels will give us formats. So we can kind of handle the basic structure, and we can handle formats at this point. What we don't have a solution for yet is gaps in the tables. I mentioned header formatting and alignment, and the lines and the shading in the table. The trouble with tables in Tableau. It's pretty rigid. You can do tables in Tableau, but it's pretty rigid in how it does tables. If you want to use bands, it's going to be at regular intervals in your table. If you want to have lines, it's got to be within some logical hierarchical structure in your data. It doesn't want to let you just format things. And that's probably good. It makes you present things in a way that makes sense, but it's a restriction in this case. We could get around maybe some of the blanks, some of the gaps in the tables if we put in dummy calculations and gave them a name like space, so that there was a blank row there, for example. But I'd be stuck to have those be exactly the same height or width as the other elements of the table, and that's probably not going to work. So at this point, I kind of had a list of options and said, maybe we need something else. Maybe this table isn't a table at all. It's not. Okay. So anyone prone to seasickness might not want to watch this slide, but when is a table not a table? The answer is when it's a scatter plot. This is a scatter plot. Okay. Is this disturbing? And I should probably stop. Okay. So I looked at this table and I thought, okay, maybe it's a scatter plot. Table, crossed it off my list. What else do we have? Probably not polygons. Probably not going to use polygons. But I thought maybe I can do this as a scatter plot. And I started sort of looking at it real hard and seeing the scatter plot. And I actually ran around my house to find a ruler because I was going to measure the exact placement of everything on my screen with a ruler. And I think I even started to measure and write these down on a piece of paper when I realized it's probably not going to work. I'm not good enough with a ruler to get them exactly where I need them. There's going to be something that messes me up. So maybe I can just put them roughly in position and fix it. Maybe there's an iterative approach that'll get me there. And essentially, I have 13 columns of stuff. And I have 13 rows of stuff. And in both cases, that's including the headers. So I'm just going to look at this as a Cartesian coordinates, 13 by 13 grid. And I make that data source. I should just mention it's all the combinations of the numbers 0 through 12 with all the numbers from 0 to 12. So it's an outer join, a cross join from the numbers from 0 to 12 and the numbers 0 to 12. You could do that in Excel. I think I did because I could just do that quickly. Or you could build it in Tableau with a join or something. But fundamentally, that's the data source I want. So then I go back to Excel to make my Tableau calculation. And this was not a picnic. I only have part of it here, right? Because it's actually 144 different calculations. I used some VLOOKUPs and some conditional logic and some stuff because I have an Excel background and a math background, so I can do that. But even if you were going to type out hopefully it's less than 144 in your case, but you only do this once. And you really need the calculations however you're going to approach this. So you got to do it somewhere. And I built them all in my Excel workbook. I just want to mention, don't worry about getting it right immediately. I've never gotten it to work on my first try, ever. It's always broken when I get it in. I'll do like 10 rows at a time or something, and if I get an error, then I'll sort of iterate and see if I get an error like I need that max, or there's a aggregation that doesn't make sense. Tableau gives you little warnings about that, so I'll go back and forth and do a little bit at a time. That's how I do it. So once I get that table, once I get those numbers calculated with that calculation, all 144 of them, my table's actually pretty close. I'm using circle marks, by the way. I use circle marks for things like this because the inclination is to use text, because you want text. But if you use text as your mark type, then the text is the mark, and it wants to put the text where the point is, and so you're sort of stuck with centered. So it's going to be hard to get your text exactly in the right place. If I use circles, it's easy for me to get circles to line up, and then my text will line up right along the circle. In this case, everything's aligned to the right. Okay. So next step, I want to match this exactly. So an easy way to do that, now that I have a scatter plot with continuous axes, and by the way, I should mention C1 and R1, at some point I changed from C and R, or row and column, to C1 and R1. The only difference at this point is that I'm multiplying by 1.0 because I wanted to explicitly convert that to a continuous measure. Otherwise, I get stuck with it wanting to make my axes integers and background images stuck at integer values, and I don't think that's going to work. So There was an explicit conversion in there somewhere. So I add the original report as a background image. Now I can adjust things right on top of it. I can move things around until they're just right, and then I can pull that out. So you got to pick, what do you attack first? There's many things we could attack first. The first thing that came to mind for me was I want my row headers to be aligned left instead of right, but I want my numbers to be aligned right. Also, I want my column headers to be centered, but we'll come back to that. Column headers are going to come closer to the end. But the problem with alignment is you only get one choice on an axis, the scatter plot. So right now they're aligned right. I could change everything to aligned left, but that would mess up my numbers. So one solution to this, I could add another axis. I can do dual axes in Tableau. So I'll add another one. Here I might need to use this magnifier that's really distracting. But so I have a second axis now out on the sheet. And for that second axis, I set the alignment to right because I want it aligned to the left. That's a little confusing. It is aligned to the right of the point that it's labeling. That's what that means. So it's going to put it to the right of the point. If those points are all in a line and all the labels are immediately to the right of them, that's effectively aligning left, right? So that's why. It also means if you have multiple lines of text, that those multiple lines are going to be aligned to the right. So that's going to create a little conflict for us later. But for now, I want to choose aligned right to get it to align left. So that's a bit counterintuitive. Okay, I get some overlap now. I'm not too worried about it. I'm going to jiggle things. But the row headers, horizontally, they're a little far over from where I want them to be. And initially, I picked just a border that went one more unit around what I was looking for. So my numbers went from 0 to 13. So I stuck my background image in from -1 to 13 in rows and columns just to give me a little room all the way around. And I see that that was a little aggressive in terms of where I want my rows to start. So I actually want my rows to start right at the same place as the table. So okay. So by adjusting those that C1 axis, my columns axis or x-axis, 0 to 14, it gets things right about where I want from a horizontal standpoint. You don't need to do this step. It was just something I did, make things a little easier for me. So that horizontal position of row headers doesn't look bad. But I want the first column of numbers is overlapping with it, so it needs to get moved to the right. Okay, so I start to add to that C1 calculation. IIF, if you don't know that calculation, IIF is basically an if statement in the Excel syntax. It's if, and then a condition, the result if it's true, and the result if it's false. So if C is greater than 0, so if I'm not in that first column, or the 0th column, then I'm going to shift by column shift 1, which is a parameter. Otherwise, I'm not. So I'm going to add a little bit to the position in the x-axis if I'm not in the first row or the 0th row. Otherwise, I'm not going to add. Right? So I have this parameter, and I just start typing values in, and things move over. Everything moves over. And the number 1.5 is not important at all. It's just how far I happen to need to move it before it was right on top of that text that I wanted to cover. Okay, and you could do this, you could keep doing this. You could create 12 parameters for the rows, 12 for the columns. I decided to adjust the axis a little bit instead because I like to use just a few when I can get around it. And 0 to 15 seem to get those next two columns to line up pretty well too. So I just did that. So there's additional gaps between the third and fourth column and the sixth and seventh column and the ninth and 10th column. So I keep doing this. In fact, I have column shift 1 and I have a column shift 2. That's my second parameter in there because I don't want to necessarily have that gap to be the same distance as from my row headers. So I'm shifting things over, again, by a little bit. And I keep using that. That one seemed to work for column 6 and column 9 as well. So I got to this point. The columns are horizontally right about where I want them. I could probably be a little more perfect. The first one maybe isn't quite there, but I thought it looked pretty good at this point from a horizontal standpoint, except for the column headers, which we're going to come back to. Okay. Do the same thing for vertical position. I have one parameter for that gap. Everything after the 7th row, I think, gets bumped down by some amount. I don't remember the number. It's not important. But eventually, I get things to be right on top of those old numbers. At this point, the numbers are all formatted the same, but that's OK. I have a solution for this. We saw it in the simple case. I'm going to overload calculations. And maybe I should magnify that. So there's label number, label percent italic. That one happens to be italicized, by the way. Label dollar, label dollars and cents, label basis points, and so on. So all the different number formats, they each get their own filtered calculation, and they all just get piled on that text shelf to build up different formatted labels. Oh, I didn't need to magnify it. I already thought of that. Sorry. OK. So number formats are fixed. Good. What's left? Placement of column headers. I've mentioned that a couple times. The formatting of the headers and the lines and shading in the table. None of these are super duper hard at this point. Well, that's not true. Column headers are a bit of a bear. The problem here is we already have a dual axis. And I mentioned you get one choice of text alignment per axis. We've used left, we've used right. We don't have center. We can't do it. We could do it with floating maybe now. I see this done with a separate sheet sometimes. Maybe at this point you decide you're going to punt and use labels or something. I worry about the adaptive nature of this, that they might get a little out of alignment. A lot of times I'll see tables like this and they aren't quite right, and that kind of bugs me. So I'm going to keep it all in one sheet and just use brute force. I have calculations already for exactly where I want these things in X and Y. So I just start to shift them. And eventually I shift them using the longest word in each header. And I think I had 2 additional parameters to shift just the first column there. And I decided not to show that calculation. But this workbook is on my Tableau public. So if you want to dive into that, you're absolutely welcome to see the full calculation. And then once I get those longest words centered, I have the problem of the whole label isn't centered. It's aligned right because I chose right alignment for that axis. But to fix that, I create this column header underscore calculation. And there's a little bit of trial and error with this. They're just underscores, and their purpose is to push that second line of text over, or that shortest line of text until it lines up and looks about centered. And I needed more underscores on column 1 and 2 than I did on the others. That's all that is. And once I have that underscore calculation, I can format it. I can stick it on my label shelf and format it and make it white, and you won't see it. It'll match the background. So I've pushed things over. It's an illusion to make you think things are centered. We're getting pretty close, the row formats. You can guess the trick at this point. We're going to overload the labels, make a filtered calculation for each one of those format types. One for bold, one for italic, and one for standard. And just overload those labels. Only one label is going to show up at a time. One of those is bold, one of them's italic, one of them's standard. I've got my underscore in there for the column header, and the column header also happens to be on this label shelf. Okay. So at this point, I made my circle marks transparent. I also made them small, I believe, so that because I worried they might move things if they were too big. I removed the background image, and I made the text black. That was probably too soon to remove my background image, but I was tired of looking at it for this presentation, so I just wanted to get it out. You might want to get your, shading to line up exactly as well, and you could leave it in until the very last moment. Okay. So we're getting close. We just need lines and we need shading. Okay? And then my CEO of my company is going to be very happy with this. They're going to make decisions very slowly with it. So for lines and for shading, I use reference lines. I use reference bands. It's a scatter plot. Scatter plots have bands and lines. I can put these things in. And I didn't bother with parameters in this case for these positions because it adjusts them as soon as I type them in. So I could just change numbers little by little until it looks about right. That first band goes from 8.8 to 13.8. I just put in a number. It was too small. Make it a little bigger. Iterate. One thing I should mention that is it'll stack things up in the order that you create them. So the first thing created in terms of bands is going to be in the back. So I wanted the column bands on top of the row bands. So I made the column bands first, and then I made the row bands later. The lines, it matters a lot less. It puts them all on top. Okay? And that's it. Boss is very happy. Right? We made the table. It adapts to a point. If you make it a little too small, the row headers will start to overlap the line to the right of it. So you got to be a little careful. If it gets too big, it looks ridiculous because the text isn't going to get any bigger. But at least within a certain reasonable range, it's going to be adaptive. It's fast because it's only one worksheet instead of 48. And that blend is only going to result in one query to the data source. It's got a bunch of calcs in it, but they aren't hard calcs. So you can do them fast. So you keep your job, right? Okay. So I'm back to disclaimers. This is Tableau way out of the box. At one point, I had it on my slide to say something is easy in Excel doesn't mean it's easy in Tableau. Just as the same way it doesn't mean if it's easy in Tableau, it's easy in Excel. They're different tools. And this is something that's very easy in Excel or SSRS or MicroStrategy. And they're OK with that. It's not easy in Tableau because they don't want you to do it. So we're breaking Tableau when we do this. You may find these tricks useful outside of this context. I hope that you do. I use these a lot, this conditional formatting for like up and down arrows for KPIs, for example, that are colored and show green for up and red for down, or some colorblind friendly palette in a perfect world. Don't become a tool for creating tables in your organization, especially if they've replaced their table creating tool with Tableau. If you make yourself a table creating tool, then you're sort of on the chopping block. Where do we go from here? We can start to enhance this table. We can start to make it a little better in ways that aren't going to drive the CEO crazy. There's some little things we can do. We could use size or color to attract attention to things that are unusual. Wouldn't it be great if the important numbers were bigger and red? That would get their attention. It's still a table. Or maybe you can add some visual elements and start to put them in there with the legacy report. This is an example of this sort of a little bit better process that Jonathan Drummey, Zen Master, what's it, Emeritus? Legend. He made this in his 2 jobs ago, I guess. And I saw it in his talk and thought it was a great example of what we're talking about. Because the numbers in red, they're a little bigger. So these numbers are unusual numbers. He wants to draw attention to them. So as you're looking at this table, you can sort of skip over the black numbers. And that's helpful. He also put some spark lines in there. It gives a little bit of engagement, a little bit of something interesting to look at, maybe some historical understanding. But it's still a big table. Okay. My preferred approach to this situation is to build something awesome instead. If I have to build the table, I build the table. Then I build something awesome. And the way you do that is you have a conversation, and this can be a difficult conversation. This is hard. You have to ask, why do they look at the table? What do they look at on the table? What do they do with it? What are the questions that this table helps them to answer? And you have to be fierce when you have this conversation, because they're going to say, you say, why do you want this table? Why do you look at this table? And they're going to say, we want to see these 144 numbers. Because we want to see and understand these 144 numbers. Wait, you want to understand all of these? What if we, what's the first number you look at? Why do you look at that? Why is it the most important? Maybe we can make that bigger. Maybe we only need to look at this column if something fails here, right? Maybe there's a path to something good. And if you answer these questions, if you have that conversation, you can create visualizations that will answer those questions immediately. And if they have more than one question, you can make more than one visualization. That's fine. And it helps them not only to answer their questions faster, but to understand why. Not only are sales lower than they were last year, but they're lower last year because of tables in the East, for example. Right? So that's what Tableau does. And so I want that to be the last thing that you take away from this, is to use Tableau as Tableau, not as a table building tool, because it's really not. So thank you. I think we have time for a couple questions, maybe, if there are any. No questions. Okay, cool. Yep.
What happens inevitably when you put this on your boss's desk and they say, this looks great, could you go ahead and add in a quarter to date column as well? Because I feel like every time I present something, it's always, oh, cool.
Yeah.
But what if we just, how's the scalability work with something like what you just showed?
I mean, it's not drag and drop.
Yeah.
But you know, I saved the Excel workbook, and I can go back in and add some rows to the calculation if I need to. Yeah, I wish maybe it was easier. I don't think this is something that one could build an extension for. I've sort of thought about this, but like somehow you'd have to pass it exactly all the things you want and where they are, and if you did all that, it would be just as hard as building it. So, yeah.
Thank you. It was great.
You had a question?
Yeah. Why you let the background? Why do you don't let the background instead of create the bands?
So the question is, why don't I use a background image? I think instead of using the bands and lines. And I thought about a background image. The reason I didn't use that was I wanted it to be a little bit adaptive, and if it's going to be probably lock the scale of that or do something funny with that. If you had a complex background that you wanted to put in there, you certainly could, you know, with some, you know, box around certain metrics or something like that. That could be interesting. Or even like a big infographic that you just wanted to have some numbers on that were updated live. You could do that, because fundamentally this is just a scatter plot putting some formatted numbers in different places. So yeah, background image is an option. I just thought bands would be a little bit more flexible, less likely to be blurry and stuff like that. Mm-hmm.
Were you ever able to go to the next step instead, this way then start adding color, changing their format, eliminate?
Not with these reports. Not with these reports. But I got the opportunity to build other reports for them that were better. I was working with a group in IT that believed in Tableau and what it could create, and wanted to make great reports, but they also needed these tables. So I made them. Yeah. Okay. Yep.
How would you handle this situation when working with multiple platforms? Say that now they want to try to have that same view like on a phone, or you have something, but it's something that's flexibility and trying to get that to work. How do you handle that situation?
That's a good question. I didn't have to face that here. They were all using laptops. They were just a little bit different size screens, but I'd have a conversation with them. You know, what's better, scrolling or changing the format, maybe eliminating some values and making a phone view. So if they need it exactly like that, then scrolling, I think, would be the answer.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for coming. And I'll stick around if anyone else has some questions after. I can hang out.